The flashlight beam cut through the darkness like a blade. Greta pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the cellar, her heart hammering so hard she was certain they would hear it from the street above. Through the narrow window well she could see boots, polished, black, unmistakably official. The Ordnungspolizei. They were checking houses again, looking for anything that violated the new regulations. Her hand instinctively moved to the small bundle hidden beneath her coat. Inside was a photograph, a letter written in English, and a chocolate bar wrapper, all forbidden, all proof of her crime. The crime of loving someone the authorities had declared untouchable. The boots stopped directly above her. She heard muffled voices, the scrape of furniture being moved. They were searching the apartment she had just fled from. In 3 minutes, maybe 4, they would find the drawer, the one with the false bottom. Inside it, more letters, more evidence of her connection to Sergeant James William Hayes, a black American soldier stationed with the occupation forces in Bavaria. The same man the mayor had publicly denounced last week as part of the corrupting influence that threatened German purity. The same man she had kissed in the ruins of the old brewery just 2 nights ago, knowing that every moment together could be their last. Upstairs, something shattered, glass hitting the floor, a woman's voice, her neighbor, Frau Zimmermann, protesting loudly. Greta knew that voice well. It was the same voice that had whispered through the market square 3 days ago, spreading rumors about the German girls who traded their honor for American cigarettes and tinned meat. The same voice that had pointed at Greta when the authorities announced their new campaign to protect German womanhood from the occupation forces. Now Frau Zimmermann was buying her time, arguing about a broken lamp, giving Greta precious seconds to decide. Stay hidden and pray they do not find the cellar entrance, or run into the night and never come back. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment below which country you are watching from. 3 months earlier, Bavaria had been a different kind of hell. Not the hell of bombs and sirens that had ended with surrender, but the quieter hell of hunger and shame. The smell of defeat hung over Munich like the smoke from still smoldering ruins. Every morning, Greta walked past mountains of rubble where apartment blocks once stood, past children with hollow eyes picking through debris for anything useful, anything salvageable. The ration cards provided barely enough to survive. 200 grams of bread, 30 grams of fat per week. The black market thrived, but prices were insane. A single egg cost more than her mother earned in a day of clearing rubble. The Americans had arrived in late April, and with them came a new social order that nobody quite understood. The occupation forces set up headquarters in the few buildings still standing. They distributed food through official channels, but the bureaucracy was suffocating. Forms in English, waiting in lines for hours, and always the knowledge that you were the defeated. That your nation had committed horrors beyond comprehension, and now you lived on the mercy of your conquerors. Greta tried not to think about the camps, about the newsreels the Americans forced everyone to watch, but the images haunted her. The knowledge haunted her. She was German, she carried that weight now. Her first real glimpse of the black soldiers came on a Tuesday afternoon in June. She had been hauling bricks from a collapsed building, part of the mandatory rubble clearing that all able-bodied Germans had to perform. Her hands were raw, bleeding through the thin cloth she had wrapped around them. A convoy of American trucks rolled past, and she noticed something that made her stop mid-step. The soldiers in the back were all black. Their uniforms were the same as the white soldiers she had seen, but they sat separately. They drove separately. Even in victory, they were divided. One of them caught her staring and gave her a small, tired smile, not predatory. Not triumphant, just human. That smile stayed with her. In a world where every interaction was defined by power and defeat, by occupier and occupied, that moment of simple human acknowledgement felt like water in a desert. She learned quickly that the black soldiers were different in other ways too. They were stationed in the less desirable areas. They got the worst assignments, guarding supply depots, cleaning latrines, hauling equipment. And despite wearing the same uniform as the white soldiers, they faced a wall of rules that kept them separate. Separate mess halls, separate recreation facilities, even separate entrances to some buildings. It was a strange thing to witness, this hierarchy within the victors themselves. Greta's mother warned her immediately. "Do not speak to them," she hissed one evening as they boiled potato peels for soup. "The authorities are watching. The Bürgermeister has already made it clear. Any German woman seen fraternizing with occupation forces will be marked. And the black ones, even worse. They are trying to rebuild our reputation, Greta. We cannot be seen as loose women who throw themselves at conquerors." Her mother's voice cracked on the last word. She had lived through 2 wars now. She had buried a husband and a son. All she wanted was survival, and survival meant invisibility. It meant following every unspoken rule, no matter how absurd. The first time Greta actually spoke to James was an accident. She had been standing in line at the ration distribution center for 3 hours when a fight broke out. Two German men, both drunk on homemade potato schnapps, started shoving each other over a perceived slight. The crowd panicked, surging backward. Greta lost her footing on the uneven cobblestones and felt herself falling. Then a hand caught her arm, strong, steady. She looked up into the face of a tall black soldier with dark skin and eyes that held a depth of exhaustion she recognized. "You all right, miss?" he asked in careful, accented English. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He steadied her, then stepped back immediately, as if touching her had been dangerous. That brief encounter should have been the end of it, but 2 days later she saw him again. He was outside the supply depot, smoking a cigarette and watching the sunset with the kind of stillness that suggested he was 1,000 miles away in his mind. She did not plan to approach him, she did not plan to speak, but as she walked past he said quietly, without looking at her, "Beautiful evening, almost makes you forget where you are." It was such a simple observation, but it cracked something open inside her. She stopped. "It does," she replied in halting English. He turned then, surprise flickering across his face. "You speak English," she shrugged. "A little school before the war, before everything ended." They talked for 7 minutes. She timed it later, counting back the heartbeats. 7 minutes in which he told her his name was James, that he was from Louisiana, that he had not seen his family in 2 years. 7 minutes in which she told him her name was Greta, that she had once dreamed of being a teacher, that dreams seemed like relics from another life now. And then a jeep rounded the corner, white officers inside, and James straightened immediately, his face closing down. "You should go," he said, his voice suddenly formal. She understood. Being seen together was dangerous for both of them. She walked away without looking back, but she felt his eyes on her until she turned the corner. The warnings came swiftly. Within a week, the local authorities distributed a new set of regulations. They were posted on walls, read aloud in town squares. German women were forbidden from accepting gifts from occupation forces. They were forbidden from entering establishments frequented by soldiers. And critically, they were forbidden from engaging in immoral relations with any member of the occupation, a phrase deliberately vague enough to cover everything from conversation to marriage. The penalties were not specified in the notices, but everyone knew: public shaming, head shaving, exclusion from ration distributions. In a world where survival depended on community support, these were death sentences of a different kind. But the regulations did not stop what was already beginning. All across Bavaria, connections were forming, hesitant, dangerous, but real. German women and American soldiers, drawn together by loneliness, by curiosity, by the simple human need for warmth in a cold world. And the black soldiers, facing discrimination from their own army, often found common ground with German women who understood what it meant to be marked, to be judged, to be treated as less than. It was a strange solidarity. Both groups lived under surveillance. Both groups faced punishment for transgressing invisible lines, and so they found each other in the margins, in the shadows between official regulations and human desire. Greta started seeing James regularly, not in public, never in public, but in the ruins, in the bombed-out buildings where nobody lived anymore, in the old brewery that had been reduced to a shell of brick walls and missing roof. They talked for hours, sitting on broken stones, sharing cigarettes he brought and bread she saved from her rations. He told her about Louisiana, about growing up in a place where his skin color determined which door he could enter, which water fountain he could drink from, which part of town he could walk through after dark. She told him about growing up in a Germany that had slowly poisoned itself with hate, about watching neighbors disappear, about the guilt that gnawed at her even though she had been just a child when it all started. What drew them together was not just attraction, though that existed. It was recognition. They recognized in each other the experience of being unwanted, of being told you were wrong simply for existing as you were. James had fought for a country that refused to see him as fully human. Greta lived in a nation that had committed atrocities in the name of purity. Both of them carried shame that was not entirely their own, but had been assigned to them by systems bigger than themselves. And in those quiet hours among the ruins, they built something fragile and defiant. They built a space where they could simply be two people, stripped of all the labels and judgments and historical weight that crushed them everywhere else. By August, the German authorities were panicking. Reports were coming in from across the occupation zones. German women were not avoiding the soldiers, they were connecting with them. Despite the threats, despite the propaganda, despite everything, relationships were forming, and the authorities saw this as a crisis. Not just a moral crisis, but a political one. The entire reconstruction of German identity depended on presenting Germans as victims of Nazi leadership, not as willing participants. But how could they claim moral rehabilitation if German women were consorting with occupation forces, especially black soldiers? It undermined the carefully constructed narrative, and so the crackdown intensified. The Bürgermeister of Greta's district announced a new initiative, a public registry. Any German woman suspected of fraternization would be investigated. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Anonymous denunciations were accepted. It was disturbingly familiar, this system of surveillance and betrayal. It was exactly how the Nazi regime had operated, and now the same mechanisms were being used to enforce a different kind of purity. Greta felt the net tightening around her. Frau Zimmermann had already been seen watching her, noting when she left the house when she returned. The old woman's eyes followed her everywhere, hungry for something to report. It was only a matter of time. James felt the pressure too, but from a different direction. His commanding officer, a white captain from Georgia, called him in for a talk that was really a threat. "We hear you have been getting friendly with the locals, Sergeant," the captain said, not looking up from his paperwork. "I do not need to remind you that fraternization is strictly prohibited by military regulation, and I especially do not need to tell you what happens to colored soldiers who forget their place. You fought well, you served honorably. Do not throw it away now over some German girl. There are people watching, people who would love an excuse to make an example of you." James left that office with his hands shaking not from fear but from rage. He had survived 2 years of combat, he had earned his rank through blood and skill, and still he was being treated like a problem to be managed. That night James walked through the rubble-strewn streets of Mannheim with his mind racing. The captain's words echoed in his skull like artillery fire. People watching, people who would love an excuse. He knew exactly what that meant. Back home in Alabama, they called it keeping you in your place. Here in occupied Germany, they dressed it up in military language, but the threat was the same. Step out of line and they would destroy you, not with a bullet, with paperwork. A dishonorable discharge, a court-martial, a stain on your record that would follow you for the rest of your life. He thought about Greta, about the way she looked at him without fear, without judgment. About the small apartment where, for a few stolen hours, he could pretend the world made sense. And he realized something that made his chest tighten. He was not willing to give that up, not for the captain, not for the army. Not for anyone. What James did not know was that Captain Harrison's warning was not just personal opinion, it was policy. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces occupied Germany, the United States Army Command became increasingly obsessed with controlling the behavior of black soldiers. Internal memos circulated among officers, warning of fraternization problems and discipline issues among Negro units. The language was careful, bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Black soldiers were being watched more closely than their white counterparts. Their movements were tracked, their relationships were scrutinized. Letters home were read by censors who flagged anything that suggested inappropriate associations. And when violations were found, the punishments were swift and severe. White soldiers caught fraternizing might receive a reprimand, a fine, or a brief restriction to base. Black soldiers faced court-martial, reduction in rank, or transfer to labor battalions. The double standard was not accidental. It was policy. Greta felt the shift before James told her anything. He came to her apartment 3 nights later and his shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched. She did not ask what was wrong. She simply pulled him inside, closed the door, and held him. They stood like that for a long time, her cheek pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped around her back. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hoarse. "They know," he said. "About us, not everything, but enough." Greta pulled back, searching his face. "What does that mean?" James hesitated. He wanted to lie, to tell her it would be fine, but he respected her too much for that. "It means we have to be more careful. It means I cannot come here as often. It means we cannot be seen together in public." Greta's eyes hardened. "So we hide like criminals," James nodded slowly. "Yes, like criminals." The irony was not lost on Greta. For 12 years, she had lived under a regime that told her who she could love, where she could work, what she could say. The Nazis had controlled every aspect of German life with an iron fist, punishing deviation with violence and terror. And now the liberators had arrived, the Americans, the champions of freedom, and they were telling her the exact same thing. "Stay away from that man, he is not your kind, this is forbidden." The only difference was the uniform. Greta had survived the war by learning when to obey and when to resist. And as she looked at James standing in her tiny kitchen, his eyes filled with quiet fury, she made a decision. She had obeyed the Nazis out of fear. She would not obey the Americans out of convenience. If they wanted to treat her love like a crime, then she would be a criminal. They developed a system. James would visit only after dark, taking different routes each time, avoiding the main streets where military police patrols were frequent. Greta stopped going to the community food distribution center where other German women gathered and gossiped. She became invisible, a ghost in her own city. James began using a trusted friend, Corporal David Washington, as a lookout. David would walk the perimeter of Greta's neighborhood, keeping watch for MPs or suspicious officers. If the coast was clear, he would signal with a lit cigarette in the window of a bombed-out building across the street. If there was danger, the windows stayed dark. It was an elaborate, exhausting, and increasingly dangerous game, but it worked for a while. They stole hours together in the darkness, holding each other like drowning people clutching driftwood. And they pretended desperately that the world outside did not exist. But the pressure was building. James could feel it in every interaction with his superior officers. The way Captain Harrison watched him during formation, the way his weekend passes were suddenly under review, the way other black soldiers started avoiding him, afraid that association would bring them under scrutiny too. One evening, David pulled him aside after duty. "Man, you need to hear this," David said quietly. "There is talk. Some of the white officers are pushing for a crackdown. They want to make an example of someone. And your name keeps coming up." James felt his stomach drop. "What kind of example?" David looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "Court-martial, dishonorable discharge. They are saying you have been defying direct orders, violating fraternization policy, and undermining unit discipline. They are building a case, James, and they have been doing it for weeks." James walked back to his bunk in a daze. A court-martial, a dishonorable discharge. Those words carried weight that most people could not understand. A dishonorable discharge was not just a piece of paper, it was a brand. It meant no veteran benefits, no education assistance, no job prospects. It meant returning to Alabama as a pariah, a man who had disgraced the uniform. And in 1945 Alabama, for a black man, that meant something even worse. It meant vulnerability. It meant being completely at the mercy of people who already hated you. James had seen it before. Men who came home with bad paper, who could not find work, who ended up sharecropping or worse. Men who disappeared. He sat on the edge of his bunk, head in his hands, and tried to think. He could end it with Greta, walk away, protect himself. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he sat there in the cold barracks, surrounded by men who would never understand, he realized something. He did not want to be safe anymore. What James did not know was that the threat against him was part of a much larger pattern. Across occupied Germany, black soldiers were facing systematic persecution for relationships with German women. In some cities, entire units were being investigated. In others, soldiers were being quietly transferred to remote labor battalions in France or Belgium, separated from their units and stripped of rank without formal charges. The army called it administrative action. The soldiers called it something else, punishment without trial. The justification was always the same: maintaining discipline, upholding moral standards, protecting the reputation of the United States Army. But everyone knew the real reason. The army was terrified that black soldiers, after tasting freedom and respect in Europe, would return to America and demand the same treatment at home. Relationships with white women, even German women, represented a threat to the racial hierarchy that American society depended on, and the army was determined to crush that threat before it spread. Meanwhile, Greta was facing her own battle. Her neighbor, Frau Kessler, had started making comments, sharp little remarks delivered with a smile. "You seem to have a lot of visitors at odd hours, Greta. I hope you are being careful who you associate with." "People are watching." The words were polite, but the threat underneath was clear. Frau Kessler was a bitter woman who had lost her husband and 2 sons in the war. She blamed everyone: the Nazis, the Allies, the Jews, the foreigners. And now apparently Greta. One afternoon, Frau Kessler stopped Greta on the stairs. "You know," she said casually, "the new German police are looking for collaborators, women who betrayed their own people during the occupation. I have heard they are very interested in women who fraternized with enemy soldiers." Greta met her eyes coldly. "The war is over, Frau Kessler," the old woman smiled. "Is it?" The threat was real. In the chaotic months after Germany's surrender, a wave of brutal violence swept across the country. German women accused of relationships with Allied soldiers were dragged into the streets. Their heads were shaved. They were beaten, humiliated, and branded as traitors. Some were killed. The perpetrators were often former Nazis trying to reclaim power, or angry civilians looking for someone to blame for their suffering. But sometimes it was just neighbors, people who had lived beside these women for years who now saw an opportunity to settle old scores or claim their apartments. Greta knew the stories, everyone did. She had seen the women with shaved heads walking through the rubble, their eyes hollow, their bodies bent. And she knew that her relationship with James made her a target, not just from the American military, but from her own people. That night Greta told James everything. They sat in her darkened apartment, a single candle flickering between them. James listened without interrupting, his face hard as stone. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "We could leave, both of us. I could request a transfer to France, or we could try to get you paperwork to come to America." Greta shook her head. "James, you know that is impossible. The army will never approve that, and even if they did, your captain would block it. They are looking for an excuse to destroy you. Requesting permission to bring a German woman to America would be handing them that excuse on a silver platter." James knew she was right. But he refused to accept it. "Then what? We just keep hiding, keep pretending, until they catch us or someone turns you in." Greta reached across the table and took his hand. "We survive," she said simply, "like we always have." But survival was getting harder. 2 weeks later, James was called into Captain Harrison's office again. This time the captain was not alone. A military police officer stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching James with cold, predatory eyes. Captain Harrison did not waste time. "Sergeant Mitchell, I am placing you under formal investigation for violation of General Order Number 97. You have been observed on multiple occasions entering the residence of a German national, Fraulein Greta Hartmann, in direct violation of standing orders." James felt the floor drop out from under him. They knew her name, they knew her address, they had been watching. Captain Harrison continued, "You are to cease all contact with the subject immediately. You are restricted to base until further notice. Any further violations will result in court-martial. Do you understand?" James stood at attention, his mind racing. "Yes, sir," the MP stepped forward. "We will be watching you, Sergeant." James left that office knowing his life had just changed forever. He was under formal investigation. That meant his movements would be tracked, his mail would be opened, his barracks would be searched. And if they found anything, anything at all, that connected him to Greta, they would crucify him. He had one chance to warn her, one opportunity before the surveillance tightened completely. That night he violated the restriction order. He slipped out of the barracks during a shift change, moved through the back alleys like a shadow, and made his way to Greta's apartment. He knocked softly 3 times, the signal they had agreed on. The door opened. Greta stood there, her face pale. She had been crying. "I know," she whispered before he could speak. "Frau Kessler told me. The military police came to the building this afternoon. They were asking questions about me." "About you?" James felt his chest tighten. They were closing the trap. They stood in the doorway, neither moving inside. They both knew this might be the last time. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was every letter Greta had ever written him, along with a photograph they had taken together in secret. "You need to burn these," he said quietly. "If they search your apartment and find anything with my name, they will use it against both of us." Greta took the envelope, her hands shaking. "James, I cannot do this. I cannot pretend you do not exist." James cupped her face in his hands, his voice breaking. "You are not pretending, you are protecting yourself, and you are protecting me. If they destroy me, Greta, they win. If we survive this separately, then we still have a chance. Someday, somehow." Greta closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "How long?" James did not answer because he did not know. James kissed her once softly and then turned and disappeared into the night. Greta stood in the doorway for a long time, clutching the envelope against her chest. Then she went inside, lit a candle, and one by one burned the letters. She watched the paper curl and blacken, the ink disappearing into ash. Every word she had poured onto those pages, every confession, every promise, every desperate hope, gone. The photograph was last. She held it over the flame, her hand trembling. It showed the two of them standing in a ruined park, his arm around her shoulder, both of them smiling. For a moment she hesitated, then she dropped it into the fire. The image twisted, bubbled, and vanished. When it was done, Greta sat alone in the dark, surrounded by the smell of burning paper, and allowed herself to cry. Back at the base, James was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Everywhere he went, an MP followed at a distance. During formation, during meals, during his few off-duty hours, the other soldiers noticed. Some gave him sympathetic looks. Others avoided him entirely, afraid that association would bring them under scrutiny too. James felt himself becoming invisible, a ghost in his own unit. The investigation dragged on for weeks. Officers questioned his friends, his bunkmates, anyone who might have seen him with Greta. David Washington was interrogated for 3 hours about what he knew. He said nothing, but the pressure was unbearable. One night David sat down beside James in the mess hall. "They offered me a promotion," David said quietly. "If I testified against you." James looked at him, searching his face. "What did you say?" David met his eyes. "I told them to go to hell." But not everyone was as loyal as David. One of the soldiers in James's platoon, a man named Corporal Lewis, cracked under pressure. He told the investigators everything he knew, that James had been sneaking off base, that he had been seen entering a German woman's apartment, that other soldiers had helped him. The testimony was vague, second-hand, and largely useless in a formal court-martial, but it did not need to be solid. It just needed to exist. 2 days later, James was handed transfer orders. Effective immediately, he was being reassigned to a labor battalion in Belgium. No explanation, no appeal, just orders. James read the paper twice, his hands shaking. A labor battalion. It was the army's way of burying him, taking a decorated combat sergeant and turning him into a ditch digger, stripping away his rank, his dignity, and his future without the mess of a trial. James had 48 hours before the transfer took effect. He was not allowed to leave the base. He was not allowed to make phone calls. He was not allowed to send letters without approval. He was being erased. On his last night in Mannheim, James sat on his bunk and wrote a letter to Greta. He poured everything into it. Every unsaid word, every broken promise, every desperate hope. He sealed it and gave it to David. "Get this to her," James said quietly. "I do not care how, just make sure she knows I did not abandon her." David nodded. "I will." The next morning, James boarded a transport truck heading west. As the vehicle pulled away from the base, he looked back at the city of Mannheim one last time. Somewhere in those ruins, Greta was waking up, unaware that he was gone, and James realized with a clarity that cut like a blade that he might never see her again. Greta did not know he was gone for 3 days. She waited at the usual corner on Tuesday evening, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. When he did not appear, she told herself he was detained by duty. Wednesday came and went. By Thursday, the gnawing fear in her stomach had transformed into something darker. She walked to the base perimeter, keeping to the shadows. She saw other soldiers, heard American voices, but James was not among them. A young German woman she recognized from the market approached her. "They moved the Negro units out," the woman said quietly. 2 days ago, trucks going west." Greta felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the cold stone wall beside her to steady herself. "Did anyone say where?" The woman shook her head. "No one tells us anything." Greta walked home in a daze. The apartment felt smaller, the silence louder. She sat at the table and placed her hands flat on the wood, trying to anchor herself to something real. He would not leave without telling her. He promised. But the empty days stretched ahead and doubt crept in like frost. On the 5th day, David appeared at her door. Greta opened it cautiously, and when she saw the uniform, her heart leapt. But it was not James. David removed his cap and held it in both hands. "Miss Greta," he said, his voice formal and careful, "I have something for you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. The envelope was slightly crumpled, but her name was written clearly on the front in James's handwriting. She took it with trembling fingers. "Where is he?" she asked. David hesitated. "Transferred. Orders came fast. He wanted you to know it was not his choice." Greta stared at the letter. "Where did they send him?" David shook his head. "I do not know, ma'am. West, somewhere in France. They do not tell us much." She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of hope. "Will he come back?" David met her eyes. "I do not know," he said honestly. "But he told me to make sure you got that letter. He wanted you to know he did not abandon you." Greta nodded slowly. David replaced his cap and turned to leave. She closed the door and stood alone in the dim light. Greta sat by the window and opened the envelope with shaking hands. The letter was 2 pages, written in careful block letters. "My dearest Greta," it began, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I want you to know that leaving you is the hardest thing I have ever done. This was not my choice. Orders came in the middle of the night, and by morning we were loading trucks. I tried to get word to you, but they would not let us leave the base. I do not know where they are sending me. I do not know when I will be able to write again, but I need you to understand something. What we have is real. I do not care what the army says. I do not care what the world thinks. You are the only good thing that has come out of this war for me. I will find a way back to you, I swear it. If it takes months, if it takes years, I will come back. Wait for me, Greta, please. Yours always, James." She read the letter 3 times, then she folded it carefully and pressed it against her chest. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once. The weeks that followed were the longest of Greta's life. She moved through her days like a ghost. She stood in the ration lines, scrubbed floors at the hospital, returned to the empty apartment. At night she reread James's letter until the creases in the paper threatened to tear. She wrote letters of her own, long, desperate letters addressed to James Carter, United States Army, France, but she had no unit number, no base name, no way to ensure they would reach him. She mailed them anyway, handing them to the American postal clerks at the Mannheim base with trembling hands. Most were returned weeks later, stamped addressee unknown. She kept them all in a small wooden box under her bed. By late March, she realized she had not bled in over 2 months. At first, she told herself it was the stress, the hunger, the cold, but her body knew the truth before her mind accepted it. She was carrying James's child. She sat on the edge of her bed and placed a hand on her still flat stomach. A child, their child, and he was gone. Greta knew she could not hide it forever. By April, her dresses were getting tight. She told no one at first, moving through her routines with a quiet determination, but the other women at the hospital began to notice. One afternoon, an older nurse named Frau Holtz pulled her aside. "You are pregnant," she said bluntly. It was not a question. Greta did not deny it. Frau Holtz's face softened slightly. "The father," Greta hesitated. "He is gone," the older woman studied her. "German," Greta shook her head. Frau Holtz's expression darkened. "American," Greta nodded. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Frau Holtz sighed. "You know what people will say." Greta met her eyes. "I do not care," Frau Holtz shook her head. "You should care. This is not just about you anymore. It is about the child. A German child with an American father will have a hard enough life." "But if the father is—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. Greta's hands clenched into fists. "I love him," she said quietly, "and he loves me." Frau Holtz looked at her with something like pity. "Love does not feed a child, girl." The whispers began soon after. Greta felt the eyes on her as she walked through the market. Women who once greeted her now turned away. Old men spat on the ground as she passed. One afternoon, she found the word Hure painted on her apartment door in crude black letters, Hor. She scrubbed it off with trembling hands, but the paint had seeped into the wood grain, leaving a faint shadow. Frau Weber from downstairs confronted her in the stairwell. "You bring shame on this building," the old woman hissed. "Lying with the enemy, a Negro no less. Have you no dignity?" Greta stood her ground. "He is not the enemy." "The war is over," Frau Weber's face twisted with contempt. "The war will never be over for women like you. You think the Americans will take care of you. You think that man will come back for his bastard child." The words struck like a slap. Greta pushed past her and climbed the stairs to her apartment. Inside, she locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The doubt Frau Weber planted grew like a weed. What if James did not come back? What if he could not? By May, Greta's pregnancy was unmistakable. She lost her position at the hospital. Frau Holtz delivered the news with regret but no surprise. "The administrators say it is inappropriate for you to work with patients," she explained. "I argued for you, but they would not listen." Greta nodded numbly. She had expected this. Without the hospital work, money became even tighter. She sold what little she had left. Her mother's silver spoons, a pair of leather boots, a wool blanket. She ate less so the baby would have something. The child moved inside her now, small flutters that felt like hope and terror in equal measure. She wrote to James every week, pouring her fear and loneliness onto the page. "I am carrying your child," she wrote in one letter. "I do not know if you will ever read this, but I need you to know. I am scared, James. I do not know how to do this alone, but I will. I will protect this baby the way you protected me. Please come back, please." She mailed the letter and walked home through the spring rain, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. In early June, David appeared at her door again. Greta opened it and saw his face, and her heart sank. He looked exhausted, older somehow. "I do not have good news," he said quietly. Greta stepped aside to let him in. David removed his cap and stood awkwardly in the small room. "I got a letter from James," he began. "He is in France, near the Belgian border. He is trying to get reassigned back to Germany, but the army is not cooperating. They are stonewalling him at every turn." Greta felt the floor tilt. "Why?" David met her eyes. "Because of you. They know about the two of you. Someone reported it. Maybe an officer, maybe another soldier. It does not matter." They flagged his file. "They are making sure he stays as far from Mannheim as possible." Greta sat down heavily. "Can he come back at all?" David hesitated. "Not while he is still in uniform, and his discharge is not scheduled until late next year." "Maybe longer." The room felt airless. Greta looked down at her hands, at the slight tremor in her fingers. "I am pregnant," she said quietly. David closed his eyes. "Does he know?" "I wrote to him," Greta said, "but I do not know if he received the letters." David nodded slowly. "I will try to get word to him, but you need to understand something, Miss Greta. Even if he knows, there is nothing he can do right now." The army owns him, they can keep him in Europe for years if they want, and with a black soldier and a German woman, he did not finish, he did not have to. Greta felt the tears rising but fought them back, she had cried enough. What do I do? She asked. David looked at her with something like admiration. You survive, you keep that baby safe, and you trust that James will move heaven and earth to get back to you, because I know him. He will not stop trying, Greta nodded, wiping her eyes. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He sent this. He wrote it before he knew about the baby, but he wanted you to have it. Greta took the letter with shaking hands. David stood. I will do what I can, he promised, but it might take time. Greta watched him leave, then opened the letter. The letter was shorter this time, written in haste. My dearest Greta, they are keeping me here, and I do not know why. Every request I make to return to Germany is denied. Every letter I send to you comes back unopened. I feel like I am fighting a war I cannot see, but I have not given up. I will never give up. I am trying to find a way. There are lawyers, civilian groups that help soldiers with family issues. I am reaching out to everyone I can. Please hold on. Please do not think I have forgotten you. You are the first thing I think of when I wake and the last thing I think of before I sleep. I will come back to you. I swear it on my life. Yours, James. Greta folded the letter and placed it with the others. The baby kicked, a small, insistent thump against her ribs. She placed her hand over the spot and closed her eyes. Your father is coming, she whispered. He is fighting for us. But as the summer heat settled over Mannheim and her belly grew heavy, the silence from James became unbearable. No letters, no word from David, just the endless waiting. In late August, the labor pains began. Greta woke in the middle of the night to a sharp, tearing sensation low in her abdomen. She gasped and sat up, clutching the sheets. The contractions came in waves, each one stronger than the last. She was alone, there was no one to call. She pulled on a dress and walked, bent over with pain, to the hospital where she used to work. The night nurse recognized her and did not turn her away. They gave her a bed in a room at the end of the hall, away from the other mothers. Greta labored for 14 hours. The pain was unlike anything she had imagined, a force that consumed her entirely. She screamed James's name more than once. The nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. Finally, as dawn broke over the ruined city, the baby came. A boy, small but healthy, with a cap of dark curly hair and skin the color of warm honey. The nurse cleaned him and placed him in Greta's arms. Greta looked down at her son and felt a love so fierce it frightened her. You are here, she whispered. You are real. She named him Thomas, Thomas James. It felt right, a piece of his father carried in his name. But the world outside the hospital room was not kind. When Greta walked through Mannheim with the baby in her arms, the stares intensified. Women crossed the street to avoid her, children pointed and whispered. One afternoon, a man spat at her feet and called her son an abomination. Greta held Thomas tighter and kept walking. She had no money for proper food. She had no family to help her. The ration cards barely covered her own needs and babies required so much. Diapers, milk, medicine, she sold everything she owned, her mother's wedding ring, the last photograph of her father. The furniture in the apartment piece by piece. She moved to a smaller room, then a smaller one still, but Thomas thrived. He was a quiet baby, watchful and serious. His eyes were dark like his father's, and when he smiled, Greta saw James's face so clearly it broke her heart. She wrote letters to James every week, telling him about their son. She never received a reply. The turning point came in October. Greta was at the market, Thomas bundled against her chest, when she heard a voice she recognized. Miss Greta, she turned. It was David. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were kind. David, she breathed. He looked down at the baby and something flickered across his face. This is, Greta nodded, Thomas, his son. David swallowed hard. James does not know, does he? Greta shook her head. I wrote to him so many letters. But nothing comes back, David exhaled slowly. I know why. They have been intercepting his mail, both ways. I found out last week. A sympathetic clerk told me, the army is deliberately keeping you two apart. Greta felt a surge of anger so powerful it left her breathless. Why, what have we done? David's jaw tightened. You broke the rules, and the army does not forgive that, but listen to me. James is getting discharged next month. They cannot hold him forever. Once he is a civilian, he can come back. Greta looked up at him. Will he? David met her eyes. He does not know about Thomas yet, but I will make sure he finds out, and when he does, nothing will stop him. David kept his promise. He wrote to James that night, a letter that bypassed the military postal system entirely. He mailed it to a civilian address James had given him months earlier, a friend's house in Ohio. The letter reached James in early November. He was living in a barracks in northern France, counting the days until his discharge. When he opened the envelope and read David's words, the world stopped. Greta had your son. His name is Thomas. He was born in August. She has been alone this whole time, James. The army has been blocking your mail. She thinks you abandoned her. You need to come back. Now." James read the letter 5 times. A son, he had a son. And Greta had been raising him alone, thinking he did not care. The rage and grief that filled him was overwhelming. He walked out of the barracks and stood in the cold November rain, his hands shaking. He had missed everything: the birth, the first months of his son's life, Greta's suffering, because the army wanted to punish him for loving the wrong woman. He made a decision in that moment. He would not wait for his official discharge. He would go AWOL if he had to. He would get back to Mannheim. He would find his family. James arrived in Mannheim on a freezing morning in late November. He had hitchhiked, bribed truck drivers, and walked the last 15 miles. He was still in uniform, technically still under military jurisdiction, but he did not care. He went straight to Greta's old apartment. The building was even more damaged than he remembered. He climbed the stairs and knocked on her door. No answer. He knocked again, harder. A neighbor opened her door and stared at him with open hostility. "She does not live here anymore," the woman said curtly. James felt his chest tighten. "Where did she go?" The woman shrugged. "Somewhere cheaper. Could not afford this place after the baby came." James forced himself to stay calm. "Do you know where?" The woman studied him for a long moment, then her expression softened slightly. "2 streets over, the building with the blue door." "3rd floor," James ran. He did not care about the cold or the stairs or the ache in his legs. He found the building, climbed the stairs 3 at a time, and stopped in front of a battered door. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she did not want to see him? What if she thought he had abandoned her on purpose? He knocked, footsteps inside. The door opened. Greta stood there, thinner than he remembered, her hair pulled back in a scarf. She stared at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then her face crumpled and she covered her mouth with her hand. "James," she whispered. He stepped forward and she collapsed into his arms. They held each other in the doorway, both of them shaking. "I am sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I am so sorry. They kept me away. They blocked my letters. I did not know about Thomas until last week." Greta pulled back, tears streaming down her face. "You came back." He cupped her face in his hands. "I will always come back, always." From inside the apartment came a small cry. Greta wiped her eyes and turned. She disappeared for a moment, then returned carrying a bundle. She pulled back the blanket and James saw him for the first time. His son, Thomas. The baby had his eyes, his nose, his serious expression. James reached out with trembling hands and Greta placed Thomas in his arms. The weight of his son, the warmth, the reality of him hit James all at once. He looked down at Thomas, then at Greta, and felt something break open inside his chest. "We are a family," he said quietly. Greta nodded, tears still falling. "We are." James stayed. He went AWOL officially, risking court-martial, but he did not care. He could not leave them again. Over the next weeks, he found work on the black market, trading goods for money to support Greta and Thomas. He wrote letters to civilian advocacy groups in the United States, lawyers who specialized in marriage cases involving occupation soldiers. The legal battle to legitimize their relationship and bring Greta and Thomas to America would take years. There would be hearings, paperwork, bribes, and bureaucratic cruelty, but they faced it together. In 1947, Greta became Greta Carter in a small civil ceremony overseen by a sympathetic German official. In 1948, after 2 years of legal warfare, the United States government finally issued travel papers for Greta and Thomas. They boarded a ship in Hamburg on a cold March morning. James stood on the deck with his wife and son, watching the German coastline disappear into the fog. Thomas, now 2 years old, looked up at his father with those serious dark eyes. James lifted him onto his shoulders. The world had tried to keep them apart. The army, the government, society itself had worked to erase what they had built, but love, it turned out, was more stubborn than hate, and in the end, it had won.